My name is Lynette Pohlman. I have the privilege of being the director and the chief curator of the University Museums. I'm here with Dr. Rosson DeLong, our partner. Leah has been working with the University Museums since about 1995 in order to do scholarship and place Christian Petersen in American art history. She is indeed our guest curator and our guest scholarship, and has expanded our knowledge and understanding of Petersen immensely over the last 30 years. Much of the Petersen Art Museum and the art collection is based upon her scholarship and her accomplishments. Our next step is to do full research on this particular work of art, Petersen's Unknown Prisoner. Not only the research, but our project will include a major scholarship publication, an exhibition, and hopefully pointing up this small sculpture, this 14-inch sculpture, to a next size up of about 40-inch as perhaps even a full-scale model. Leah, why do we do this?
Well, we've known about this sculpture for a long time, but only recently have we begun to understand the context in which Petersen created it, and only recently have we begun to understand its significance and distinctness, not only within his work, but in American sculpture of the time, and specifically sculpture with a war or a political commentary.
I'm very interested at this time just because world events repeat themselves. Petersen's war interpretations and expressions were valid and relevant in his day, and today these are the same similar questions that this work of art addresses. And it adds not only to Petersen's body of work, but to our understanding of human suffering and human conflict. I invite you to be a part of this project and to help us attain its full measure of re-exploring Petersen as well as the human condition. Thanks for your consideration.
We're going to look at a sculpture by Christian Petersen, who was the artist in residence at Iowa State University from about 1934 to 1955. He died in 1961. This sculpture is one that has been known in the collection for a long time as Unknown Prisoner. And for a long time, we didn't really know very much about it. I assumed that it related to World War II. Christian Petersen did a lot of war sculptures, war memorials during his career. And I'll just say at once that the character of his war memorials and his war sculptures and sketches were not so much to celebrate victories as to mourn the sorrows and loss of war and human conflict. So, in the context of World War II, which he felt very deeply because he had to watch many of his students here at Iowa State go off and serve in the war. So he was deeply affected by it. I assumed this had to do with World War II, but eventually we found out differently. The only bit of information that we had about this sculpture was a note from Christian Petersen's wife, Charlotte, who was his archivist. She said simply that this was a sculpture he had made for a sculptural competition. Well, that in itself was unusual because Petersen rarely entered into sculptural competitions. In fact, I know of only twice that he did it. He actually even avoided juried exhibitions. So for her to note that this was in a sculptural competition was unusual. But we didn't know what to make of that. But eventually we began to do some research and discovered that there was a sculptural competition with the term Unknown Prisoner in it. It was an international sculptural competition sponsored by the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London. And the theme of this sculptural competition was the unknown political prisoner. So there's an important clue. It wasn't just the unknown prisoner, it was the unknown political prisoner. Once we found the specific competition, then it put a different slant on this sculpture. We knew then that it was not about World War II specifically, it was about the Cold War. In the United States, The competition was administered by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and 193 American artists sent in proposals for this. In the end, only 11 Americans were chosen as prize winners to go forward into London to be judged in the final competition. The final competition was won by a British artist by the name of Reg Butler. So Christian Petersen was not part of that. His work was probably rejected almost at once. And one of the reasons that I have been trying to research this is to try to understand why was it rejected. I always imagine this jury of museum administrators at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1951-52, which is when this took place. I always imagine them just quickly rejecting Petersen's work. And the reason I think that is that most of these museum administrators were far more interested in abstract works of art. And the work that finally won the final competition was a highly abstracted work of art. Now, obviously, Petersen's sculpture is not abstract. And so we wonder, why were they so favorable towards abstraction? This is post-war. The idea of the competition is to pose the values of the Western democracies against the Soviets and the Soviet bloc and other communist countries. So this is very much a Cold War competition for Western art, which is dominantly abstract in the early 1950s. One of the things I've often wondered is, why was abstraction so fully embraced in the 1950s? And I think it has to do with World War II in part. World War II had been documented thoroughly, as no other war had been, by film and photography. There was no denying the realism of those images. They were very powerful, they were very specific, and they were ones that you could hardly look away from. And so I believe that many artists, and this is not just unique to me in thinking this, many artists felt that realism had reached its limits for artists. You couldn't top the photographic images. And so it was more important to focus on the emotional, expressionistic, spiritual aspects of the experience, which could be more universally expressed through abstraction. I say all that to give a basis for why I think Petersen's sculpture was probably fairly quickly rejected. We don't know for sure, because the jury didn't give us any specific guidelines other than very general ones. So knowing that the sculpture was rejected, and by the way, as I said, there were 193 entries from American artists into this international competition. There were very few from the American Midwest, and there was only one from Iowa, and it was Christian Petersen. All right, well, let's look at this sculpture for a minute and try to guess why they might have rejected it and what its qualities are. First of all, what you see here is that it's a realist image. He's using the human form, the recognizable, figurative human form, and he's using it in a classical manner. So there's nothing very abstract about it, other than its setting, which is in a cruciform sort of shape. It's a realistic human form, and I think that alone might have made it seem backward and out of touch in the early 1950s. But let's look at some other aspects of it. It has qualities of both anonymity and universality. It's a human form, you can see, and his hands have been affixed to this slab by straps, what appear to be straps. He isn't supporting his weight any longer. His feet are dragging. We can't tell if this figure is dead or alive. In this sculpture, this figure is clearly here deliberately. It is a sculpture about conflict, but this person has been placed here deliberately. This is not an accident, nor is it the collateral damage of war. This is a person who is here for a reason. He is hanging by straps that look as if they're reusable. So we have the feeling with this sculpture that these straps have been used before and they will be used again. One of the unusual things about this figure is that it's turned away from us. And Petersen shapes the sculpture so that this arm goes in front of the figure's face. We can't tell who he is. We can't see a facial expression. We don't know of his suffering, and usually the way we humans tell about suffering is through the facial expression. Petersen denies that to us. In addition, not only can we not see his facial expression so that we know whether he's dead or alive or if he's suffering or conscious or anything like that, we also can't tell who he is. When you turn the face of the person away, you not only deny us an image of the face, you deny the personhood. In other words, Petersen drains this figure of a personal identity, which is what torture and war does. It takes away personhood. We don't know who this is. It could be anybody, could be everybody. And that's part of the strength of this work, is that he doesn't give us an identity. And to take away the capacity to recognize this figure through the main way that humans recognize each other, through the face, is a very powerful statement to make. It pushes the work towards the universality that belies the realism of the figure itself. Now let's address another issue that seems obvious to us in the West, but maybe as time goes on will not be so obvious, and that is the association that we might make with Christian iconography or the crucifixion of Christ. If the jurors made that association, you can understand why they might wish to reject it, because it's too linked to the past, too linked to a specific iconography that's already established. And Petersen supports that in a little bit because his slab is cruciform shaped. It's a generalized form, but it's still a cruciform shape. And in the West, we are going to tend to push that towards the image of the crucified Christ. You can see that he probably did it just to support the hands and to give it an appropriate background and support for the body, but it's still something that we associate. And Petersen surely knew that. But one of the important differences is the anonymity of the figure. In the crucifixion of Christ, Christ is displayed publicly so that you can see, and towards the front, so that you can see the suffering on the face. You can also see the way the body has been battered and damaged. There's not a mark on this fellow. He's hanging by straps. So we can't see those things. And so it begins to take it out of that specific realm of the association of Christ. And one of the characteristics of this kind of an execution is that it's public humiliation. And you can't be publicly humiliated if people can't tell who you are. Now, one of the other characteristics of this association that we could generally put with this sculpture is the narrative of the crucifixion. You don't have to subscribe to Christianity in any way, shape, or form to recognize the narrative of the crucifixion, which is a person who is innocent is tortured and executed without mercy and without justice. No matter if you believe in Christ or not, that is the story. And that's the situation of political prisoners. And so they're innocent people, but they're being tortured deprived of their very personhood. We can't even mourn them because we can't see who they are. And in contrast to Christ's crucifixion, which was very public, this looks as if it could have been carried out in various ways, perhaps publicly, but somehow when I look at this, I always imagine that it's being carried out in secret. It's being carried out in some horrible torture chamber somewhere where nobody can witness what's being done to you, and so your hope for justice and mercy is never going to come true. So even though we can make these associations with the Christian crucifixion, I think by emphasizing the anonymity and the universality of this figure, by denying him any identity other than his body, we can take it out of that realm and apply it to a more universal and human form. Well, okay, fine, but it was still rejected, and this was shipped back to him. And so for a long time, we didn't know the context of this sculpture, and we didn't know why he had produced it. But we know he was very serious about it because he had drawings about it, a number of drawings, including a drawing that enlarged this sculpture to at least life-size or maybe over life-size scale. So that was Petersen's ultimate goal. We see it here in this 12 or 14-inch high maquette, which is what he proposed and sent to New York to be judged. But he also sent along drawings that showed that he would have liked it to be larger. Christian Petersen devised and proposed a number of war memorials for this campus. None of them were ever executed or put into place. None of them were ever actually realized on campus. And this one is not either. This is all we have. But perhaps it would be interesting to imagine it on the scale that Petersen himself hoped it would be.